Fellow here at the American Enterprise Institute. I'm also a columnist at the Washington Examiner. And I think you've seen erupt around the country, especially in this last year, a discussion on criminal justice reform, on overcriminalization, on all sorts of things. We're going to focus today on a specific aspect of that. And let me just, my thoughts on part of why I picked this. This is about prison specifically. And I've got libertarian leanings. I think too many things are illegal. I'm a Catholic. I think justice and mercy need to be played up. On the other hand, I don't know, and I don't think necessarily we'll get into today a question of are we maybe locking up all the millions of people we lock up makes our country safer? That's a tricky question to debate. And here at AEI, you'd have lots of opinions on that. But my question is, once we put people in prison, are we doing anything to help them, or are we just ruining lives? And so having prison sentences serves a deterrent effect, so there's some good there. It keeps dangerous criminals off the street, so there's some good there. But we call these correctional facilities. Are they doing anything to correct, or are they just making things worse? So given, bracketing for now the debate to some extent of overcriminalization, although that will be relevant, once people are in prison, are they being harmed? Or are we treating them in a way that will benefit society or hurt society? I think we know the answer to that question, maybe, but then can we change anything going forward? So what I did to discuss this is I asked two guys I know who I dealt with in their lives. I write about lobbying and politics, so I brought in a former lobbyist and a former politician. On my right is Kevin Ring, a lawyer and a former Republican congressional aide. In fact, he was executive director of the Republican Study Committee. He passed through the revolving door, became a lobbyist in 1999. He wrote a book, which was a big reading in my house with my brother when he was in law school. It was Scalia's Dissent. So I guess you compiled the book. It was an excellent book. If you're feeling angry and want some good things to sort of get your bile up and running, read Scalia's Dissents. He now is at the Families Against Mandatory Minimums. And on my left, Jeff Smith, former Missouri State Senator, congressional candidate who a lot of us stumbled upon in a documentary called Can Mr. Smith Still Go to Washington? And he is now an assistant professor at the New School in New York. The reason I bring them here, though, is that they both have served time in prison. So before we get to the substance, quickly, Kevin suggested, so as not to hide the ball, why don't you guys quickly, however entertainingly or whatever you want, explain why you spend time in prison.
Oh, I'll make it really funny because it's such a laugh. No, I was a lobbyist, and I had the misfortune of working for Jack Abramoff, who was the big Republican lobbyist at the time, was the leader of, ended up being the Abramoff scandal, big scandal in the Bush administration. And I was basically charged with honest services fraud, which is a junior varsity form of bribery. I contested those charges at 2 trials and was ultimately found guilty. And I served 16 months, a 20-month sentence, and I served 15 and a half months in federal prison camp in Cumberland, Maryland.
And I forgot to mention, I said the documentary name was Can Mr. Smith Still Go to Washington? What I have in my hand is Jeff's brand new book for sale out in the lobby called Mr. Smith Goes to Prison, which tells this story very well. But can you quickly tell us?
Sure. When I was in the Senate in Missouri, I was on a panel, and the moderator asked a question that I found too intrusive, and I took kind of the butt end of the bottle and bludgeoned the moderator. No. No, actually what happened was, so I was running for Congress back in 2004. We ran like a really grassroots campaign. I'll try to condense this as much as I can. I was running against the dynasty candidate, Russ Carnahan, whose dad was a successful 2-term governor, whose mom was a U.S. senator, and sister Secretary of State. And we were kind of trying to run a grassroots campaign and get over the top. About 3 weeks before Election Day, 2 of my aides were approached by a consultant who billed himself as a so-called practitioner of the political dark arts. He told my aides that he wanted to put out a postcard detailing my opponent, Carnahan's, it was a 10-way race, but detailing Carnahan's dismal attendance record as a state legislator. My aides came to me and said, he wants to do this. should we give him the information? The voting record? What should we tell him? And I replied, I don't want to know what you do. And they said, well, so does that mean we should do it? And I said, it means you shouldn't tell me anything. Do you understand that? And they said, okay. So they gave him that voting information, which was publicly available, but it violates the McCain-Feingold statute because it constituted illegal coordination between my campaign and a third-party group. I lost by about 1 percentage point. About a week after the campaign, my attorney prepared an affidavit for me to sign in response to a Federal Election Commission complaint that Carnahan had filed. He won, but he pushed this complaint, and the affidavit had 15 statements. 14 of them were true. 1 of them was not. It denied any knowledge about that postcard. Even though I knew that my aides had met with the person who I figured put it out, I signed a false affidavit. 5 years later, when I was a Missouri state senator, my best friend called me. He told me that the man who had done that postcard 5 years earlier had just been picked up by the feds for mortgage fraud, bank fraud, wire fraud, illegal weapons possession, spousal abuse,
A car bomb.
cocaine distribution, heroin distribution, and he was the chief suspect in the car bombing that nearly killed his ex-wife's divorce lawyer. And I had let my aides get mixed up with this monster. And my best friend and I said, well, what are we going to do? You know, what if the feds come and knock on our door because this guy says, well, 5 years earlier, I can deliver somebody to you who's a state senator. And so my best friend and I talked about that for a couple months, and little did I know that entire time he was wearing a wire. So then I was basically, my only chance to stay out of prison was to do something similar, and I didn't do that, and I was sentenced to 1 year and a day and was in federal custody for about 10.5 months.
Thank you. And so the part of, I think where I want to start here is with, from your guys' experience and from your knowledge professionally working with families with incarcerated people, does prison do anything to help criminals? And can it, or does it just sort of ruin lives and make people worse off?
Well, that's a broad question, and I think for some people, prison serves a purpose. There are dangerous people out there who should be kept away from civil society. There's no doubt about that. And I think no one would disagree with that. So I think to the extent that the people are physically dangerous or they have some compulsion problem where they're going to keep offending, prison may be the only solution. But I think we've come to a point where there's a large swath of people who prison isn't necessary. And for those people, prison can play different roles. For some, there are a lot of people in prison who are uneducated. These are not master criminals. We put a lot of faith in the fact that our criminal laws will deter bad behavior because if we ratchet up penalties, people will be more inclined to follow the law. That's just not the population I met with. These are people who just didn't think they were going to get caught. They didn't give it a lot of foresight. They didn't read the U.S. Code to figure out what the penalties were. They didn't do cost-benefit analysis. They just sold drugs because they wanted extra money. That was most people. And I should say, and you should read Jeff's excellent book. It captured my experience almost perfectly. There's a myth about white-collar prisons because not only are we white, we're white-collar. But there are no white-collar prisons anymore. So most of the people in my camp were drugs and guns violations, people serving mandatory minimums for drugs. And so it was a real wide array of people. Some people got something out of the prison experience. Some people just needed to age out. They were immature. They had just limited brain functioning, and they just needed to grow up and mature. There are other people who didn't speak much English, had very limited education, and they were able to get their GED while they were there, and that may have helped. For most of the people, though, it's just killing time. And people would say, well, that's okay. If you're bored, that doesn't bother me. But it should, because while you're sitting there like a can on a shelf, the job market's advancing, technology's advancing, your family's moving on, everything is changing. And you have no responsibilities really when you're in prison. You may have a job, but it's a lot of makeshift jobs. And so your skills atrophy. And Solzhenitsyn said, man is a creature who can get used to anything. And I think that's what happens to prisoners. You'll hear it that they get institutionalized. So you learn what it takes to become a decent prisoner. You stay out of fights, you stay out of stupid arguments, you don't touch other people's laundry, just that sort of stuff. But you go to the commissary, you have a limited amount of things you can buy. You learn that lifestyle. And for some people who came from really dangerous areas, there's a certain comfort in that. And when they get close to leaving, they got very nervous because they were afraid of the choices. So for a lot of people, long sentences without any meaningful programming, and we'll address that, because unless you are able to get drug treatment for your addiction, or you get your GED, there's really nothing else available that's going to help you reacclimate. And that's a real problem. And so when you look at the recidivism rates and people say these people come out and they reoffend, I know people who are going to try to do the right thing who I served with. Some people will be fine. Some people are going to try to do the right thing, and after a few years, they're not going to be able to make ends meet. They have their family to support, and they are really at risk to going back to the lifestyle that sent them there in the first place. And so I really do want to talk. I want to give Jeff a chance, but I want to say there's so much more that can be done on the programming side of things, but it has to be coupled in a way that not only do we do more to treat them while we're there, because not only is it compassionate, but it's in our interest, because that's who's reoffending, but also we have to shorten the sentences, because there's no amount of programming that's going to sort of satisfy somebody for 10 or 20 years of living in that kind of confinement.
Jeff, did you see anything there where you thought people were being helped or being improved? Anybody left sort of, with better impulse control or more prepared for world than they came in?
Not really. I wish I could tell you differently, but in my experience, prison did a lot to create better criminals and almost nothing to rehabilitate people. So there's three ways that I can talk about. So if I'm going on too long, just stop me. But the first way is that prison reinforces people's tendency to operate outside of the rules and outside of the normal economy. And the way it does that is pretty simple. Most people have a misconception that when you get locked up, you've got it made. You got 3 hots and a cot, and you're fine. But actually, most prisoners are destitute. They don't have a penny to their name. They get into prison. They don't have someone on the outside to put money on their books. Maybe some of them do for their first year, their first 2 years, but then people fade out of their lives and kind of forget about them. And so the problem with that is that not everything, you don't have it made. In fact, you have to buy your own soap. You have to buy your own deodorant. You have to buy your own toothpaste. So the basics of personal hygiene are and if you're living virtually on top of hundreds, if not thousands of other people, and hygiene is really, really important for a lot of reasons that I could get into later. But the point is, if you want to have a normal lifestyle where you just have basic hygiene needs met, let alone anything else to make your life halfway comfortable, you got to find a hustle. Right? And so the hustles range anywhere from things that are totally legal, like guys who develop their artistic talent and they draw portraits of other guys' girlfriends or children that people can send home for birthdays or Mother's Day, to things that are a little bit less legal, like bookies who make book on the prison basketball games, to guys who run barbershops, which the prison is fine with, to guys who run tattoo parlors, which the prison is not fine with. To then the most lucrative hustle, which is guys that are smuggling contraband in. So there's all types of hustles, and I would tell you, and I may diverge. I appreciate your kind words about the book, Kevin, and I agreed with almost everything you said, except I found some very skilled men in there. And I would say that in my experience, there's not a single concept you could learn at Wharton that you couldn't learn inside federal prison. New product launch, quality control, territorial expansion, risk management, barriers to entry, supply chain management. I heard every one of these concepts elucidated numerous times using somewhat different lingo than you would learn it at Wharton, but they understood every one of these concepts, and unfortunately, there was no training at all to help people translate their intuitive grasp of the business world that they had learned through success in the drug world. No formal training to turn those into formal enterprises on the street. There was a computer course that was offered. I'm going to tell a story real quick if you don't mind. About a month, there were 3 courses while I was there. There was one GED course that they had a prisoner teach, and so the prisoner didn't really care that much for most of the time, and so If you didn't want to go, you didn't have to go. And then there was a hydroponics course, because what better way to prepare someone for successful reentry than to learn how to grow tomatoes in water for 2 weeks? And then thirdly, there was a computer skills course that was a pre-release course, so everyone on their way out. Finally, we had been salivating, the whole time over this room that had 12 brand new computers, but no one ever got to go in it. It was locked the whole time. And then a month before release, a dozen of us got to go. We sat down at the computers. I was in Appalachia in southeast Kentucky, and the CO tells us, to sign in, and we sign in the form, and he says, we all sit down, he says, all right, you see that button on the bottom right? Push it in. So we push it in, computer turns on. We sit there for about 90 seconds. And then a prisoner starts playing with the mouse, and he says, yo, CO, if you push the, shut the up. Okay? We sat in silence for another 35 minutes. And then at the end of about 40 minutes in, CO says, y'all remember that little button on the bottom right? We'll push it again, and then get back to your cell. But since we had all signed in, they could tell the BOP that we had successfully completed a computer skills course, and now the prison could get their stipend from the federal government for having done that. So that, I would say, was sort of the indicative of the amount of rehabilitation going on.
So that's where I want to go now, is with programming. That it does happen, right? It's supposed to be part of the federal system, the state system, and I mean, do they try it? What can work? Computer seems like a good thing that would learn, because that's a huge part of what sort of creates a coming apart in society, is that some of us have good ability to deal with computers and others don't. Are there career-based things? Are there just, could you teach somebody some impulse control, or is it too late by the time they're there? What would you want to see if you had to do this?
Well, I would just say the courses that Jeff talked about, we had summer ones, so I could take, these are called ACE courses. They're taught by inmates. Most of the programming there is taught by inmates. And so I didn't take hydroponics, but I could take Jeopardy. I could take a class on current events or crocheting and get credit. And it was all busy work, and it was just the prison administration wanted to show that they were keeping us busy, and most of the guys wouldn't even go to the class. They would just sign the attendance form to say that they went. Then they'd get their certificate, and when you'd go to your review, you would give them their certificate, and they'd, I'm so busy working hard, and we're rehabilitating you. So everyone felt good about this con we were all in on. But it was really, I joke about it, but I really think it's so corrosive, because these are people who need to learn the rules. As Jeff was saying about these hustles, there were people who did all those things. They'd iron shirts, they'd make food, we had bedding. I didn't care about any of that. I didn't really partake in it, but I didn't care about it. It's just I thought, this is the place where you've broken the rules. You're at your lowest of low. This is the one place where you really want to get on board and do the right thing. And the prison doesn't care. And so there's nothing there for people, so they make their own, it's just sort of idle minds, idle hands. People end up doing the wrong thing. But so the programming was really lackluster. In terms of the things that I thought, there's drug treatment, but there's fewer addicts, I think, than people would think, at least in the federal system. There were only a couple people who came in that were really strung out and were in the throes of an addiction that needed help. There were people who had dependency who probably needed help, but it's not necessarily why they committed their crime. They were trying to make money if they were selling drugs or guns. But the thing that I thought was missing the most was some sort of cognitive behavioral therapy, some sort of psychological work, some therapy. A lot of these folks come from communities where that is frowned upon, and there's people everywhere who frowns upon this. But the lack of impulse control, the just sort of the emotional disconnect, a lot of the behavior there is antisocial. And that's what got them in this position. And now they're going to the most antisocial place in the world, where you're walking around with headphones on, screaming your music to no one, and no one can tell you to be quiet because no one's going to screw with you. And it just perpetuates the worst behaviors. And so I think that a lot of the guys, the fights that you'd see would be over turning the TV channel, or somebody calling a foul in a basketball game. And those are things that you have these people in a fishbowl. You have them there. They might not seek this help otherwise. But while you have them there are certain things you could do to work with them to get them thinking about their thinking patterns, get them thinking about their behavior and the choices they're making and the roots of those choices. People do what they were raised to do, and they're not thinking about it otherwise. Even those of us who try still struggle and have to remind ourselves, wait a minute, why do I feel this way? These guys aren't thinking of any of that, and it's not cool to think that either. But at Cumberland, for instance, we had 250 prisoners, and we had one trained psychologist, and she was the head of the drug treatment program. She didn't want to do any more work than that. So when I was there after a little while, and I had 2 young girls who I was missing terribly, and I knew some of the other guys who were missing their kids, we talked about putting together a group that, like, there was an AA, an NA, different support groups, and we said, let's put together a father's group so that we can talk about ideas about how to stay in touch with our kids, how to use our minutes, how to use things like finding out the guy who creates pictures that we can send, anything you can find to stay close to your children. That's what you want to do. And you also want to be able to just say, I am bummed out. I'm dying. I had a visit this weekend. I'm really sad. You don't go cry on your bunkmate's shoulder. It's a men's prison. And so to have a group like that, I thought, okay, this will be a sure winner. The psychologist wanted no part of it. She just wouldn't even respond to my emails asking if we could put that group together. So there's a lot of lip service and talk about family reunification and how important it is to stay close, but there's not a lot that gets done. And as Jeff said, that CO who said, now you can leave, that's the level of concern. It's sort of, I checked the box, I gave you your computer training. It doesn't matter if you learned anything. So there are things that can be done, they're not being done. I think the states do a better job, at least some states do from what I hear. But the federal government is really far behind.
So I'm going to ask you in a second about something you alluded to, how I think you use in your book the phrase convict code, about how you have to behave to not have other prisoners make your life horrible. But before you talk about that, I want you to just say what you can say about programming. Do you think psychological help is possible, helpful? What are your thoughts on any of that?
So I agree with everything Kevin said. I'm jealous. You guys had crocheting? Wow. We know that.
And I'm a master now.
Okay. And a current events course. I actually applied to teach a current events course. I put in cop-outs to teach 5 different courses. And instead, I was put to work. If I see a couple of you have the book. If you turn the book on the back, then you can see what my job was. Those are my. I worked in the warehouse on the loading dock, and you can see my crew that I worked with, and you can probably tell which one I was. Yeah, when you see that. Anyway, so no, and I'm not trying to be like a mark. Like, you do the crime, you do the time, and you do the time how they want you to do the time. Not how you want to do the time. And so, I'm not going to complain about my job, but I definitely think, I had a decade's worth of teaching experience, and I had been a state senator, and I would have loved to have teach a course. I applied first to teach a Black history course, because I was a Black studies major in college, and most of the prisoners were Black, and I thought that could have been interesting. I wanted to teach a current events course. I applied to teach. Then I realized, like, anything that had any political or ideological charge was never going to fly. And so I applied to teach, like, a job interviewing course and, like, a resume writing, that could teach guys a little more about that. But they ignored all 5 requests. Although, about 3 weeks before I got out, they did finally move me, which was interesting. I had fallen off of we moved about 35 or 40,000 pounds of food a day into freezers that were bigger than this room, and I fell off the top of a freezer a few weeks before I left. And then I don't think they were going to move me, but the lieutenant governor of Missouri happened to visit the next day, and then they figured that he might have come in response to me falling, even though it was totally a coincidence. And when they figured, like, oh, you might have some juice behind you, then they did move me. And then they sent me to the education department, and then I was heartened. At least it wasn't going to be long, but at least I hoped I would get to teach. And the guy in charge of it, he said, inmate, what's your education level? I said, PhD. And he said, all right, we'll start you off sweeping the classroom. And so I swept the classroom for my last month.
One thing I would say, it's not to put it too much just on the Bureau of Prisons, because I was going to teach a writing class as well, because a lot of guys asked me to edit things they were doing, either court filings or or coursework. They're doing correspondence courses, and they would ask me to write. And I think writing is a lost skill anyway, but in prison, it's pretty miserable. And so I said, some guy said, oh, would you teach a class in writing? And same thing, resume, cover letters, just basic letters like that. And I have to say, part of the problem was no one would have come. I mean, a couple of the guys would seek me out privately, but they weren't going to come from 5 to 6 at night because the prison wasn't going to make them. So there were some guys who were interested and would, but I don't want to put it all on the prison. The prison should have made them come. And I said to a guy,
if anybody can compel somebody to do something.
Well, that was the thing. So the head of education, he said, he was talking about another class. He said, how did 50 people go to this class? That room doesn't even hold 50 people. It was an electrical class. I said, right, they're not going. And he said, well, wait a minute, if they're not going, why am I giving them all certificates? I said, because you don't know who's there and who's not. He said, well, how do I fix that? I said, you stay and you check attendance when people come in and out of the class. He said, all right, forget it.
Right. So what you said really spoke volumes. The first thing you said, oh, people would come up to me and ask me for help, but they wouldn't go to a class. And that's what I experienced. Like all the time, people wanted help. They wanted tutoring on their GED. They wanted me to help write a resume, all that stuff. Like they would quietly come to my cell and ask. So there's definitely interest in it. Yeah. And I would actually say like a pretty insatiable thirst to like figure out what they're going to do next and how they're going to acquire a skill. But yeah, doing things formally through the prison wasn't always interested in that. So there's a lot of research actually on prison education programming, and the RAND Corporation just did a study. They did a meta-study of dozens of other studies of prison education programs around the country, and it showed that first of all, there's a 43% reduction in recidivism for prisoners who advance educationally while they're incarcerated. Secondly, for every dollar we spend on prison education programs and vocational training, there's an almost $6 return in reduced costs related to that recidivism. And that makes sense if you think of a 43% reduction and you think it's costing on average about $31,000 a year to incarcerate someone, then you can see how much money we could save doing it. So what kind of courses? So you talked about therapy. I mean, therapy would be so important because people don't have an outlet. And like what prison teaches you so many things. It teaches you a way to behave, like to suppress all emotion all the time.
This was going to be my next question. Is you do talk in the book about the convict code that making eye contact or seeming too friendly. But I mean, there's a way you have to behave, which is antisocial in a way, that you have to learn rules of survival that probably are counterproductive outside. Is there anything? I mean, I can't imagine that being something that would be easy to fix. Or is it rooted in the fact that it's sort of the prison versus the prisoners? Is there anything that could be done, even if you were just dreaming, that could make prison not foster that code of that pushes people towards antisocial behavior?
So I would say yes, there is, and like that code, what results is, number one, a tendency to suppress all emotion, because you learn very quickly that any show of emotion is a show of weakness. Right? To be like, I'm so excited for the visit I'm going to get this Saturday. No, don't say that. Okay? You don't tell anyone else about your family. You don't tell everyone how much you miss your kid. You don't do anything, because then they know how to get to you. Right? And there's a lot of people that play a lot of mind games in there. They have a lot of time on their hands. They've developed really sort of acute senses for other people's weaknesses, and they will prey on that. So you learn not to express any emotion. You, of course, develop a tendency to overreact to small slights, because if someone cuts in line ahead of you and you don't step to them, then you're weak, and everyone knows you're weak, and then people are going to find other ways to try to exploit that. And so all these tendencies that you develop, of course, are totally dysfunctional out in society, and that's the root of the problem. Does it have to be this way, you ask? No, I don't think it does. I've been in a prison in Texas. That was the most positive place, where the camaraderie and the enthusiasm for learning exceeded anything that I've experienced among PhD candidates at the new school. I'm being honest. There was a nonprofit called the Prison Entrepreneurship Program, which, full disclosure, I'm on the board now, that operates inside 2 prisons in Texas. They run a 9-month-long MBA-level curriculum where it culminates in prisoners who compete in a Shark Tank-like business plan competition. They'd have 9 months with the help of visiting executives and MBA students from all over the world who advise them on the creation of these business plans. And the sort of positivity and just genuine like care and concern and even love for one another was I felt like, you know, it was similar to that of like a great winning high school team or college team. And the recidivism rate for graduates of that program over the last 11 years, 6%.
Wow.
Less than 1/10 of our national recidivism rate. And several men have started multi-million-dollar businesses as well. So I think there are ways, we see examples of ways to create an atmosphere that's very different.
So that's cheering that there are examples of these things being done right.
Yes, I don't want to disagree. And this is, and again, when I read the book, I spared everybody telling my story because he really told it perfectly well. The one thing I would say about that is my sense of some of the folks there was too many, Bill Gates just waiting to be born. And I'm afraid that sometimes we romanticize the prison population to think that these are people you'd have to a dinner party. This is, everybody's least valuable players. It's not a great group of people to hang around with. I say that. I was there, so I'm not trying to be above it. If I said these things there, which I would do, people would put it right back on me that I was with them, and I get that. It's just these are low skill, low education, bad social skills, all of which I think can be dealt with. But I don't want to mislead people into thinking that they're all budding entrepreneurs, because what worried me the most is when people would come up and say, "Hey, I've got this, business plan. I'm going to come out with an app." They didn't even know what an iPhone was, but they had an app that was going to sell. It was going to be like gangbusters if somebody just heard of this idea, and they'd been sitting there for 6-7 years. They didn't know market research or anything like that. Those are things that they didn't know what they didn't know. Mm-hmm. So I felt like with some people, you shouldn't worry about being your own boss when you get out. You should just go hope to be a cog in a machine somewhere. Like, you don't need to compete with Walmart. You just need to be a greeter at Walmart. Just hold a job. Get something that pays the bills and supports you, and don't crush your dreams. But you're going out with a felony conviction. You don't know what the job market's like. And so I thought the prison could give people a little realism too. By giving us so much space, they let people dream really unrealistic dreams, and I thought that was really counterproductive for the people who really needed a dose of reality as to what they were going to face when they got out. I was the exact opposite. I was so fortunate. My circumstances are so much different. So I can exempt myself from that. I knew what I was going to do when I got out. But a lot of these guys don't, and they get scared. But if they're allowed to dream unrealistic dreams, I don't think that's helping them.
I want questions from all of you guys in a minute, but so I have one last topic for these two. Re-entry. When they get out of prison, are there existing programs? You've studied a lot of these that work, and also just so that people here who haven't had anybody close to them go in and come out of prison, or what are the challenges besides not having seen an iPhone?
So a huge challenge is family and community support. We talked about how heartbreaking it is to watch men who work. I don't know what your wage was for your job, but I made $5.25 a
week,
which
right?
A lot of people say that's not bad, and then I tell them that was my monthly wage. For 40-hour-a-week work in the warehouse. And so, but of course, like you, I was lucky, right? Yeah. Like, I had money. I didn't have a ton of money. And most of it went to my lawyers, but and then I had to pay a big fine to the government, and so that was most of the money but I still had enough to like have someone send me $100 here, $100 there, so I always had money on my books if I needed it. Most of these guys, you're working, you're making, somewhere between $5 and $25 a month. And not only do you have to buy the basics of like personal hygiene, but sometimes you have child support arrears accumulating while you're incarcerated. And then, just to try to stay in touch with your family, where I was, the interstate phone calls were like, $1.50 a minute for me to call home. Other guys, it was even more. There's some prisons where they've been as much as $14 a minute. Now, the FCC just changed that in a ruling that came out last week. Thank thanks to the great work of FAM, Kevin's organization, and some other organizations as well. But this is, a huge problem upon reentry is just the resentment that a lot of family members have because guys didn't stay in touch, and they don't fully understand just how hard it was to get the resources to stay in touch, right? And you never tell people how bad it is in there. You don't tell people how hard it is. That's just part of the code. You don't want people feeling even worse than they already feel. And so you say, oh, everything's fine. But so family and getting family back together, that's a big challenge. Obviously, the fact that 90% of employers perform background checks is a huge obstacle. One of the reasons I'm such an advocate for entrepreneurship is because so many people won't hire you.
Right.
And I'm not saying everyone's going to get out and do an app, so I don't want to be misunderstood.
No, I know.
I know we might have a slightly friendly disagreement about this stuff, but basically, these guys, they could run their own trucking company if they get a CDL, right?
Yeah.
They could run their own landscaping business. They could run their own barbershop. They could run, their own janitorial business. They have that entrepreneurial spirit. That's, in many cases, what led them into the drug trade, because they said, I don't want to go work at McDonald's and make $7 an hour. I want to do better. And so the challenge, though, is channeling that energy into, something that's legitimate enterprise. And then also, literally, figuring out a way to get them, just the sort of basics. Like a halfway house, my halfway house was worse than my prison.
Yeah.
I don't know what yours was like, but my halfway house was crazy, and when you put people right back in that place, 650,000 people every year come back to the doorsteps of our communities, the same communities where they've already failed, except now they've got the added stigma of a prison record, and they're broke, and they have to pay for their halfway house room, and they have to pay for their drug testing, and they have to pay for transportation and clothes to look decent in a job interview. It surprises me sometimes that 1 out of 3 people don't reoffend. How they're able to get back on their feet. So we need practical, we need therapy, therapeutic resources, not a PO that's being like, be here, be there at this time. If you're late, I'll violate you. You need to be here for the drug test. But somebody to counterbalance that and say, how are you feeling about being back here? What do you need that can help you?
Yeah.
Can we help you with bus passes? Can we help you learn to use the internet? You don't know any employers, you don't have anyone you can list as a reference, we've got some people who you could talk to. A database of employers, like second chance employers, that are willing to hire people. It's great to see Coke and Walmart ban the box, but we need also proactivity. We need people to step up and say, what are the resources that it takes to identify, recruit, hire, and then support and retain people who were incarcerated.
And I'm a conservative libertarian guy, but that sounds like the perfect sort of thing for a nonprofit on sort of local by local, state by state level to do. Do you think that should be part of the criminal justice system to do that, or would you see that being done outside?
There's an amazing company that started a foundation. The company's called Dave's Killer Bread. Dave wasn't a killer, but he was incarcerated. And he was the brother of the company owner, and he came out and they said, we want to help you, can you bake some bread? He starts baking the bread. There's some good cooking in prison, isn't there?
Very
I
good.
miss the nachos.
Yeah.
You miss them? But he made the bread totally different. He experimented with all kinds of innovative stuff, and it went nuts, and everyone wanted it. And it grew like hundreds of percent, and now it just got acquired by a much bigger company because it's been so successful. And they decided they were going to make it their mission to be a second chance employer. Almost 40% of their employees are people who came out of prison, and they just put on a big summit for employers all across the Pacific Northwest to learn what they're doing. And so, I think I think government could have a role in connecting people and giving more than $20 and a bus ticket back to wherever you're from, in connecting you to those resources. I'm not optimistic, given my prison experience, that they're going to take that seriously, because frankly, one of the COs, when people would leave, his line would be, he'd say, well, I'll see you in 6 months. It's jackasses like you that remind me I'm always going to have a job.
Yeah.
So
I would say I'm a small government guy for the most part, but I do think the reason there's a role for the government is because the halfway houses, you're still under the department's control. I mean, I was still serving my sentence when I left, so I had to do home confinement for a couple months. And I got to go to Rockville and quickly get to home confinement. But if I had to go to Hope Village in D.C., I know a lot of people have been to Hope Village. It's way worse than your prison for most people. I mean, COs are stealing things from the inmates. And some people at Cumberland would pass up their halfway house time, even though they wanted to be closer to their family and their community and start getting a job. They didn't want to go to the halfway house because they didn't want to deal with it. So I think there's some minimal standards that could be set to control these. Rockville, even though I didn't have to spend time there, they have a good reputation because they really spend time getting people on the phone. They require them to spend a certain amount of time applying for jobs. That's their whole focus is you're going to apply to 10 jobs a day. And so there's a set period where they're making them do that. So they're really on them. And so I think that's a good thing. You mentioned Coke and Walmart, and I would just say this is one of those cultural changes that need to happen.
Well, explain more. Not everybody.
Oh, okay. I'm
knows
sorry.
what
So
ban the box means.
Coke, Walmart, Target, some of these companies have just voluntarily said, we're not going to put on our application whether you have a criminal conviction. We'll find that out, right? I mean, through an interview process, but we don't want to knock you out of the consideration based on that one fact alone. So that's a smart move. They did it on their own. There's no law that requires that. President Obama just announced he's going to ban the box for federal contractors, so that's not asked. I'll just say this, as a conservative, I think an employer can ask whatever they want. So this idea to me is less about what it's actually going to do, because I mean, a lot of the guys I serve with, they could not get asked it on their application. They'll submit their resume and there'll be a 10-year gap. So it's not going to take long for somebody to figure out where you've been, or some people list their prison jobs because they don't want to have that gap, and they did do some work. So I'm not so optimistic about that. It has to be a cultural change. There's no law that's going to do this, that's going to make people hire offenders and give them a second chance. We have to do that. I do not. I have to do a community service because after 2 trials, I couldn't afford to pay a fine. So I have to do 200 hours of community service. I live in Montgomery County. If there's more progressive or proud of its progressiveness county in the world, I don't know it. It's Bernie Sanders, war's not the answer. Hillary's a fascist up there. And so this is the greatest place you should be able to come home to. And yet I got turned down by 3 different places to do community service because of my felony conviction. The places had blanket policies not to hire felons. I don't seek to be paid. I have a law degree. I just want to stack books in your used bookstore, but they will not hire me. So forget ban the box. Forget about even not asking me. How about getting rid of policies that don't even allow you to consider me at all? And so, again, I think it's cultural. I think it's just us saying, and knowing more people who've gone to prison, saying, I'm not going to write you off because you served some time. I'm going to judge you as an individual. I'm going to get to know you. And I think that's what has to happen. That's not a government solution, though.
So one possible government solution, and we might disagree on this, but I think that even people on the right, I think definitely people on the right might find this interesting. Remember what I said the CO said when people got out? That really embodied the incentive structure as it operates for prison wardens and prison administrators and COs. They have a job because they know there's going to be a constant supply of us. What if we turned it on its head? What if we gave stipends or bonuses to COs who worked in prisons? If we tracked everyone who came out of prison, and if they went 5 years without recidivating, then we gave a $5,000 bonus to the COs at the last 2 prisons where they were housed. Maybe if we turn the incentives on their heads, then prison guards would be more focused on boosting you up than tearing you down.
I totally agree with that. I would take the sort of warden or the head of the facility, I'd put it on him to create that culture. Yeah. And I certainly would want to know, I think wardens judge themselves now on, nobody escaped today. That's like, all right. But everybody who leaves your prison is reoffending. And that's, and we want to know that. So the Bureau of Prisons could at least track that information. How are different facilities doing? Because we also build these prisons in Dogpatch, USA. So a lot of the people that are guards that Jeff has imitated very well were the type of people I had in Cumberland, and they were this close to being inmates themselves. And I didn't find them any more moral or educated or anything than the people that I was serving with. And so what's the training for them? I mean, what is their background? Why isn't the the head of my prison know something about psychology and motivation, and like instead of insulting people, try to build them up?
Is there any state or locality or county where there are, that you guys know of, where there are sort of good incentives or wardens are given a job which is to help people? Or
I know this idea has been discussed. I haven't heard it implemented.
You know what? I'm gonna commit some liberal apostasy right now.
Yeah, but I just want to quickly say, until, if I hadn't said Republican Study Committee, until about 5 minutes ago, you couldn't have told that he was a Republican, he was a liberal. Now it's all going to come flowing.
But this is sort of a positive. Like, the people who've done this the best over the last few years are like Nikki Haley in South Carolina, Nathan Deal in Georgia, Rick Perry in Texas. You know, the Texas recidivism rate is like just a little more than 1/3 the national average. Texas recidivism rate is like 23%. Right? They're doing great. The best prison I had ever been in, the one I told you about, that's in Texas. They, and the liberals and cynics might say, well, the reason the recidivism rate is so low is because they execute so many people, and there's 236 people who couldn't possibly recidivate. But I will say this. Conservative Republicans and Southern, especially in the South, governors have really led the way over the last 5 or 6 years on both on the inside, on the front end on sentencing reform, and then on trying, to be more compassionate inside of prisons in a way that will reduce recidivism. And it's a credit, and Nathan Deal's made this a focus of his governorship. John Kasich in Ohio, not only did he focus on this, but then he ran for re-election on specifically, this issue, which is pretty encouraging to me. So,
audience questions. Yes. We've got a microphone. It will come to you. Please.
Identify.
Yes.
My name's Dave Price, retired journalist and educator. I want to begin with an accolade and then go into my question. First, gentlemen, thank you. I'm sure there's times when you kind of regret what happened to you. But I think it's been my impression working in urban schools and areas that the one population that probably is least represented is prisoners, both while they're in prison and even more so when they come out. So I think that's good. And my question kind of comes along with that. You talked a little bit, Jeff, about this, but what's been the reaction, not so much to you personally, but to your message? I think it's such an important message. You're out there delivering it. Do you think people are hearing you? And if they're hearing you, are they beginning to act, or are there people? I mean, obviously it's going to be a multiple of things, but just the message. How's it being received out there now that you're giving it as an expert?
And also along political lines, is it being received differently?
Yeah. It's just as you'd imagine. Some people, I didn't want to be the guy who came out and was the expert, right? So, and it's not because I didn't want to relive the experience. I worked for families against mandatory minimums before I was indicted. So I was involved in these issues. I had been on the wrong side of these issues when I was a staffer on Capitol Hill. I wrote some mandatory minimum laws when I was a Senate staffer, and I was young, and I knew nothing, but I thought I knew everything. And so part of this was a little bit of penance and just the idea that it didn't appeal to me as a conservative anymore that we would let politicians draft sentences for cases they knew nothing about. So I thought I wanted to get that message out. And I am lucky that, as Jeff said, there are so many other conservatives who are doing that. At a personal level, you think you're getting so much support, right? Because those are the people who are talking to you. It's sort of a self-selecting process. I know there are people who, what I don't like is in any other walk of life, experience matters. And especially if you're conservatives, if you're a businessman and you're complaining about the EPA, people would say, well, because you're out there, and if they're screwing with your business, we want to hear your viewpoint. Well, if I say, hey, listen to my experience with the Justice Department, they said, oh, of course you say that, because you broke the law. And so, so you got like Bernie Kerik. I mean, nobody's done more to fight crime individually than Bernie Kerik. He was the NYPD chief during 9/11. He ran Rikers Island. But if you're going to dismiss him because he's got a conviction, and by the way, Jeff never talks about reforming the law in where his conviction was. I talk about mandatory minimums. I wasn't subject to one. Bernie Kerik doesn't talk about tax reform. We're talking about the system that we saw, and unfortunately we have experience. So I'm a big boy, I can take it, but I don't like when that discount is, and that experience is discounted because people think it's a motive I have. I'd just as well not talk about this. But I was there, I saw it. I helped create a bad system too as part of a staffer, being a staffer. And so the reaction is mixed.
obviously there's that sample bias of like the people who come to events that where I'm selling my book are probably going to be people who are favorably predisposed to the message. But the most heartening thing I think is that I've tried to go to places that are unexpected. You know what I mean? I go on conservative talk radio. I go, on liberal. I go wherever I can if people invite me. And I have had very, very few people come back to me and say, well, what about rapists? What about, and I actually talk about rape in my standard talk because I think it's important to talk about it because there's no clearer example of how we operate our prisons driving recidivism than rape. Because we tolerate rape culture inside of prison. There are more rapes that happen in prison every year than there happen on the street, than happen outside of prison. And how do we handle that? Well, we laugh about it. Like our pop culture, it's a staple of our detective shows, Law and Order, to say, hey, the prosecutor says, oh, don't drop the soap, to the perp who's going away. I mean, how callous do you have to be to think that no matter what happens to you on the inside, you deserved it because you broke the law? That's crazy. And unfortunately, a hugely disproportionate number of men who are raped or gang raped, and repeatedly so on the inside, come out and tragically attempt to reclaim their manhood in the way they perceive it was stolen from them on the inside. And so, I am trying to talk about issues that a lot of people don't want to talk about. In some ways, I'm a good messenger for it because I was a policymaker and I actually worked on criminal justice reform as a policymaker, and then I am a researcher too, and so I can bring that angle. In other respects, I'm not the right messenger. Like I'm a white, highly educated. I'm not representative of the prison population. But in a perverse way, I can reach people that other people can't reach, and so I'm hopeful that I can do that and spread the message to people who wouldn't have otherwise maybe listened.
Speaking of white, you may have noticed that we are all white. He was attacked, Jeff was attacked in his campaign as a well-known Caucasian when he was running in a known Caucasian in a district that was largely black. We invite people here, we try to get a diversity. Some people say yes, some people say no, so I want to apologize for that. So yes, Cheryl.
Hi, I'm Sherilyn Harley-Laban, a lawyer and a writer. We've got 6,000 federal prisoners that are being released. Jeff talks about in his book about one of the reasons why he was doing I think you were doing inventory on the loading dock is because he could read. And he had math skills. So I'm curious. There's been a lot of reports about how there are limited number of books in prison libraries. They don't allow newspapers. So what are these 6,000 prisoners going to do if they can't even read and have minimal math skills? I mean, you can't even bag at the grocery store without having literacy skills or math skills.
Either of you experience this also, the illiteracy?
We had newspapers. We had a library I worked in for a little while. I had books sent in. Again, part of this is, not everybody's in there dying to read. Some people can't and want to. Some people really do use that time to self-educate because there's not classes.
That's not the norm.
No, that's not the norm, and that's honest. If these guys were really starving for education, some of them, they wouldn't be in the position they were in. So in terms of the 6,000 coming out, I just want to say, because FAM's been having to respond on this a lot, that this was not the Obama administration's decision. This was the Sentencing Commission, right. And if we cannot tolerate this 6,000, who are really the lowest of the,
say more about what the
okay, I'm sorry.
Is.
Yes, so there's been news reports about 6,000 people being let out early from federal prison who are drug offenders. And if you listen to Bill O'Reilly, you think you should run to your basement and lock the door because they're all violent folks. They're not. I was in prison. I just got out 6 months ago. I was there when a lot of people got their letters saying that they were getting the 2-level reduction. So what happened was the Sentencing Commission over a year ago said the drug sentences were too high, the guidelines were too high, And since your sentence is driven a lot by the weight of the drug that was involved in your offense, they reduced the trigger of that. So for most people, they just got a slightly shorter sentence. If you had an 11-year sentence, you were going to get a 9-year sentence. And they made that change going forward, but they said, it's not fair to not include that for the people who are already serving. Let's get rid of some of the overcrowding we have, and just as an equity matter, let's do it this way. So people were allowed to go into court. They had to have a good record. The prosecutor was allowed to object. The judge had to agree to this. So the people that are coming out, there's been this fear-mongering going on about 6,000 people. Well, federal prisons let out 70,000 a year. State prisons let out more. These are like a handful in each community. And these are people who are serving drug offenses, who serve substantial amounts of time, who were coming out anyway. So if you were worried that they weren't ready for society, they weren't going to be ready a year and a half either. So it's the biggest non-issue, but it's been turned into something big. And what it scares me about it is, if we can't welcome these people back, then those who want to tackle the bigger prison issues are going to have a hard time, because these are the lowest hanging fruit that we have in the system.
What are we doing to help them?
Well, so this is.
And even the ones that are much more that have much bigger problems. I mean, these guys are the lowest of the lowest, but do they have literate skills?
Well, we're doing with them what we do with everybody, and it's not enough.
Right,
But the reason
exactly.
they delayed the decision was so for the past year, these people could transition to halfway houses, home confinement, look for work.
Right.
So it wasn't as if on November 1st, 6,000 people walked out the prison door. But if you're talking about what we're doing to prepare them, I think that's our whole point, is not enough.
And so in some of this, I mean, there's been, you guys have mentioned some examples of things that have worked in some cases. And in a lot of them, you talk about the Texas case or these other reentry programs, Rockville having some good programs. In a lot of these, I'm almost feeling optimistic that we have some solutions that have worked on a local level, and maybe they can be expanded and adapted to other situations. But on the question of people who are illiterate getting an education in a prison, is there any examples of that being done well that you guys know of?
Well, the problem is it's anecdotal. And I think this is a problem with the criminal justice system overall. We don't have good data, and it's crazy. If I said, what's the recidivism rate, you would give a number that you heard. But if I said, well, is that the number of people going back to jail, or is that the number of people just reoffending? Is that the number of people who have technical violations? You'd start to drop off and not know. But a lot of researchers don't know the answer to that either. We don't have good data. And so even when we talk about programs that work, what the BOP needs to do is also assess its programs. So I'm all for them investing in programming that we think works, that reduces, and education is a good example of that. But I want that measured and tested. And then if it works, sort of spread elsewhere in the country.
That might be the most AEI answer possible. The answer is we need more data.
Yes, more data.
Yes. In the front table here, microphone is coming from right behind you.
Good evening. My name is Elizabeth Charity, and I'm the CEO and founder of Youth Corporation, Inc., Youth Outreach Services. And what happened is I was, of course, in the corporate world. Then what I did was I lost my job, and I started a volunteer in the juvenile justice system, in the juvenile detention center. And whilst I was there, I volunteered for like 20, it's been about 20 years. And what I did was I wrote a grant, and I gave it to, submitted to the former Governor George Allen. And I started that 12-week job readiness program. But during that time, what I decided to do is come and go back to school to George Mason University. And I did a study on transforming the ex-offender to a social entrepreneur. I put together that 12-week curriculum. I have submitted it to George Mason University, and what we are planning on doing is getting college students to come in and help us teach that 12-week job readiness mentoring program, but we want it to go into the juvenile detention center. We have been given the opportunity to be able to go before the Department of Juvenile Justice to introduce this formula, and I truly would love to have some of your statements included in our study. This could be like a 2 to 3 year study in which we can be able to get the data and all that information.
Well, and so my question following up on that incredibly interesting sounding project there is, on the juvenile level, have either of you done research or looked into that? That seems like that has a whole different set of needs and problems for juvenile offenders.
It does have a whole different set of needs, and one of the most disturbing things that I uncovered in my research for the book was the number of states that put juveniles in solitary. I mean, juveniles are so ill-equipped to be.
Yes.
I mean, no one should really be in solitary except in the most extreme circumstances. Pretty much across the world, the civilized world, they've decided, you know what, this is basically slow-motion torture to do this to people. But you know, where I was, I don't know if you had this experience, but like, you know, you'd have a guy on your basketball team, and like he wouldn't show up for the game, and you'd be like, "Where's CeeLo?" And they'd be like, "Oh, he gone. Where is he? He's in the shoe." Like he's in like he's just gone. You don't know why people leave. They just disappear. They're in solitary, and then you never see them again. And like the people who came out of solitary that I saw, I mean, they were broken people, right? It had broken them, and so I mean the number one thing I think we need to do in terms of juvenile justice in this country is to absolutely forbid juvenile solitary, because no young person, especially given their neurological development at that juncture, should ever be put in solitary. So that's the first thing. But you know, I think we need to look further back. You know, everyone now is talking about like the school to prison pipeline, and it's real. You know, a friend of mine named Carla Shedd, who's a professor at Columbia, she just wrote a book on this in Chicago, and she looks at the, you know, just the way that like poor kids, mostly of color in our society, like from the minute they go to school, they're 5 years old, they're accustomed to like metal detectors and like going, you know, this sort of things that we know of as like the carceral state. And, you know, we just, so I think we need to even go further back than the juvenile justice system and make it so that it's not considered, and stop normalizing the experience of the criminal justice system for a big subset of our population.
Again, I want to know if I can be able to get statements from all
we
three
can
of
we can
you.
talk about that after.
Thank you.
Ma'am, over there in the salmon-colored shirt.
Thank you. My name is Jacqueline Pfeffer Merrill, and I serve on the board of the Advocates for the Goucher Prison Education Partnership, which offers kind of programming on a very high end above the cliche. We support Goucher College, offering liberal arts degrees at the only prison for women in Maryland, as well as a medium security prison in Jessup. And I want to ask about, here we have a very friendly audience, but talking to people who are all much less sympathetic, whether we're talking to a CO who might have only a GED and no longer gets a subsidy from the Department of Corrections to take a community college course, or taxpayers who are struggling to finance their own kids' college education. How is it that we talk, and we saw the troubles about talking about this in the state of New York, about offering, whether it's college education or other education, and spending yet more money on incarcerated people and help them see that it's really worth it? Because there are, how do we talk to the skeptics?
Yeah, Kevin.
Yeah, I talk to the skeptics a lot because I was once one of them. And so sometimes that helps, is that I remember what I was thinking when I was at that point. And it's still helpful sometimes to be working on these issues and talk to somebody on the Hill who's like, why would I ever shorten a sentence for anyone who committed any crime? You think, wait, I mean, because there's no evidence that it's reducing crime. There's, it's like, it's not helping recidivism. It's costing money. There's no cost. But I mean, there's still just this, turn on Fox.
There's a deeply ingrained, and I think especially among conservatives, there's this deeply ingrained sense that justice needs to be served, that these people do not deserve our sympathy or our help.
Until they know somebody who runs afoul of the law, and that's happening more and more. So some of these people who have come out and are now supportive on the right, just look through their family tree for a minute, and you're going to find somebody who went to jail, and all of a sudden they have a firsthand experience with the criminal justice system. Some get it for other reasons. Some just weren't around during the old crime fights of the 90s, and they don't have those scars where it's me tough on crime, you soft on crime. That old stale debate. And so. But how to talk to them, I really think it is about appealing to their self-interest, because you can't make somebody always feel compassion. FAM talks about personal stories, and that reaches people in a lot of cases. But sometimes it's not that, I don't want us to not be tough on crime. I just think what we're doing isn't tough on crime. it's tough on criminals, on individual criminals. And so if I want to show how tough I am and I send somebody to 20 years, I may feel good about how tough I was vis-a-vis that person. But if I've just made them a worse offender, if I've destroyed their family and so now these kids are more likely to go to jail, if I'm just driving up the costs across the board of what I've done, then that's not being tough on crime. It's just, and so again, I do think this is a cultural issue that is not so much legislative. I think we are very vengeful. I think I'll give you an example. There were lobbyists who were doing just what I was doing, and half of them will say, gosh, but for the grace of God go I. The other half, even though they knew I was doing exactly what they were doing, are like, well, you asked for it.
Yeah.
And we have that. There's something weird in our society where, if all of a sudden speeding on the Beltway, got you 10 years, we all do it. But the person who got caught, we'd have zero sympathy for. And so there's it's an evolutionary thing we have that once you break the law, you become the other, and we don't have to feel any sympathy or empathy for you. And that's just going to take us growing out of that. And part of it is, when I grew up, I didn't know anybody who went to prison. I don't think my kids know anybody who doesn't know somebody who went to prison. So we're going to get to a point where we're going to jail so many people that we're all going to have more firsthand experiences here. And that may be what it takes.
Just very quickly, I totally agree with Kevin. Self-interest. You appeal to self-interest. Money and public safety is how I talk to conservatives. Do you like spending $80 billion a year of your money, on a revolving door?
Well, then they say, well, that's because they get plasma screen TVs and comfy beds. You got the comfier bed. Yeah.
My bed went from this thick to like that thick. But so I talk about public safety a lot, which is like, if these people, like 93% of prisoners in this country are coming home. And what we do to them, like we are SHITing our own nest. Right? We are, these are Americans. We will see them. They will be, maybe they won't live in your suburb, but when you go down to town for the opera or for the baseball game, like you will see them. And if you want them to come out even more damaged, broken, and angry than they went in, then you've got the right recipe.
Yes, sir.
Hi, good afternoon. Great talk. Obviously very entertaining. But speaking of entertainment, before I ask a question, I wanted to know, are you familiar with the comedian Kevin Hart?
Yeah.
So I went to see him recently, and I can relate to him because he's under 5'9", or I'm 5'7". He might be 5'4" or 5'5". So it's even tougher for him to be, even that much shorter. But he does this joke about a series or a monologue about what it's like to avoid fights and why he avoids fights. And it's interesting to hear the rationale that he uses, because he basically says, I know what the consequences are going to be if I get into a fight with this person. And so I think there's a difference between the way some people think when they say, well, if I get into a fight with this person, I'll do this and I'll do this and it'll come out okay, versus someone who says, no, it's going to come out bad. I think I need to walk away from that. And so I've been able to stay out of prison because I've avoided a lot of situations where I could have made the wrong decision. And maybe it was because of my mom or my dad or going to Catholic school. I don't know what it was. But as a result, I know I would be the whitest guy in prison if I was there. I would be the whitest guy. I would be the guy they would pick out and say, you, Uncle Tom, I'm going to do this to you, right? So I want to ask you, do you people that you've spoken to actually believe that what some of the things they did that got them put into prison were actually wrong? Because I think, and this is my theory, and I don't know a damn thing about it because I've never been in prison, but I think there's a point where you decide, hey, you know what, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I should have been put in prison for some reason. There's no perfect answer, but I'm going to start reading the Bible. I'm going to start doing these other things. So do you think that anything that you did was actually, because I don't understand exactly what you said that you supposedly got put in for, but was it wrong or what?
I lied to the feds. Okay. And like, it doesn't matter whether you lie to the feds about jaywalking or structuring financial transactions or killing someone, you still lied to the feds. And I lied to them about whether I knew that a meeting took place between my two aides and a third party. I said I didn't know about that because the mailer didn't have the appropriate paid for by disclaimer. So it sounds sort of technical, but the underlying crime was a campaign finance violation, and then the obstruction of justice was, signing a false affidavit saying I didn't know anything about that meeting. So that's what I did. Do I think I did anything wrong? I think I broke the law. And therefore, in this country, I've done something wrong. I think I did something really, really stupid, okay? And it was a big mistake, and I learned a lot from it. But I also have perspective on it, and you get a lot of perspective on it by watching like the presidential campaign this year, where basically what I did, it was a $10,000 postcard. And right now, I don't want to get into too many details, but basically Jeb Bush has a super PAC that's got over $100 million in it. And his like political alter ego, who he spent the last 20 years plotting with, is running that super PAC. And so they don't really need to coordinate, because they spent the first 6 months of this year figuring out exactly what they were going to do with that $100 million. So they don't have to have a conversation about it now. I was an amateur. I was naive and stupid. And so as a neophyte, I made the mistake of doing it in an illegal way. What some politician has probably done since we came here together at lunch today. But the fact is, I did the crime, so I had to do the time. In prison, overall, one of the biggest misconceptions is that prisoners all say, like, I didn't do it.
Yeah.
They know they did it. They'll tell you they did it. And in fact, one of the guys I work with in the warehouse used to joke one time when it's a long story, but they were going to plant raw meat in my freezer jacket because they were going to get me in trouble because I wasn't stealing. And so therefore they thought I was a rat and I was going to snitch on them for stealing. So I had to start stealing. And it's a long story, but basically like there was a threat that I would have to go to a high security prison. And I was like, man, I don't want to do that. That's why I decided to start stealing. And because I didn't want to go to a max, right? And this guy's like, he's like, what are you afraid of? And I'm like, there's like murderers there. And he looks at me and he's like, only difference between me and them is I'm missed. I mean, but this guy was like very smart and very thoughtful, and like he had shot at people. He was in the drug trade and he had shot at people, and he he freely admitted everything he did. And I really believe that he was intelligent enough, and and just ambitious enough and hardworking enough. Like it was prison. It didn't matter if the boxes were stacked perfectly. Like I didn't care. And he was like, no, that's not right. Smith, come on, Senator. Like, change it around. You got to do it the right way. Like, he had pride in his work. Inside of prison, he wanted to do a great job. So I think he would be fine on the outside. And I think, even though, sure, there were guys that were already plotting their next crime. There were some of those, but that was not the norm. And maybe we had a different experience. Most of the guys wanted to fly straight.
No, that was my experience as well. One thing I would say about Jeff's story is, and this is a perfect thing, if you said, well, Jeff, you knew what you were doing. You knew what the penalty was if you said you weren't involved in that meeting, so you got what you deserved. He had no idea what the penalty was. I mean, people say, well, what were you thinking? He wasn't thinking. He made a decision in the spur of the moment without thinking everything through. That's what people do. Those are called mistakes and bad judgment. And same thing with me. I mean, I fought my charges, they were lobbying charges, essentially bribery charges, not because I disagreed with the government's theory of that I gave people tickets to events or took them out to lunches or dinners and ultimately hoped that they would do something for my clients. That was called lobbying. It was what was my intent? Did I have a criminal intent to trade those things sort of in a one-for-one basis for them? And I would have done anything to stay home with my daughters. So I would have pled guilty in a second if I could have done that. But I was going to have to incriminate others. I was going to have to testify against people I worked with, members of Congress who I did not believe were guilty, and I wasn't going to do it. So that's my sob story, and I live with it. I went to prison, and I didn't seek any sympathy from people who are serving much longer sentences for similar mistakes, things that, like, so I would say this: I was not happy I was involved in the system I was involved. I gave them the fat to pinch. So I'll take my lumps. I was sort of raised that way, that, you know, you ask for it, watch who you hang out with. But the people there, again, they didn't think about their conduct. And if you had said, well, the penalty for this crime is 5, or the penalties for 25, it would not have altered their behavior, because they weren't doing cost-benefit analysis. And so I wish, you know, sort of this, you know, growing field of behavioral economics would inform more of our policy making here, because there are things you can do to sort of, you know, prime people to make better decisions, or to at least punish them in ways that responds. Restorative justice. Make the person who sold drugs be accountable. Go to a clinic where people are really trying to get off drugs. Let them see the repercussions of what their drug trafficking did. Don't let them sit in a cell for 10 years where they have no, you know, face-to-face contact with that. So there's other things we can do, but I think this whole idea of these people made mistakes. They're not innocent. I agree. When I'd say to people, say, oh, system's racist, every black guy I met in prison would say, this system's racist. I said, did you do it? They're like, yeah, I did it. I'm like, all right, let's go play basketball. You know, it's like, what are we saying then? You know, it's like no one was in there fighting out trials. They all thought I was an idiot that I had gone to trial. And so, but what matters is not whether they're guilty. Everybody at FAM we work with is guilty. The question is the punishment proportional to what they did? And I don't think it is in a lot of cases. And that's what we need to reevaluate. Are we safer because of the punishments we're doling out?
Well, I think this has been a great discussion. Again, the most cheerful thing to me is that there are programs on smaller scales that have worked. This has now been taken up across the ideological spectrum, criminal justice reform broadly, including prison reform. I'd like to go on forever, but we're incapable of doing that. I will say Jeff's book is for sale outside. They take credit card. He'll sign it for you. And just a quick note on this. When I got the book, and I still had the dust jacket on, and it's got Jeff's picture on the front, my 5-year-old said what he says about every person he sees in the newspaper. He says, is that your friend? I said, in case he actually is my friend. What's the book about? It's about when he went to prison. And suddenly all my older kids gathered around, and they thought that was a really interesting story. And it was an informative thing for me to talk to him about it. My oldest asked if she could read it. I said no. So just buy it. Don't buy it for your 7-year-old child yet. But I thought that was a really interesting thing, that exposure to that. It's something in the Bible we read about, but you're supposed to visit and care about the imprisoned. But it was a new thing. And so I see it getting picked up across the spectrum. I hope that these little solutions on the local level can bubble up. But I want to...
And speaking of little kids in the book, my 4-year-old son, every time we're out in public, he's very gregarious. He's probably got the politician in him. And he just walks around to everyone and he says, hi, have you read Dad Went to Prison?
Thank you guys all for coming.
That was good.
That was such a pleasure. Do you have time to grab a quick bite?
Yeah,
Okay.
Yes, definitely.
He's got to get to Virginia by 3, but we can go downstairs after.